There comes a moment in an empath's life when something changes so quietly that nobody else notices it at first. The arguments may look the same, the misunderstandings may sound the same. Someone may still question your intentions, twist your words, or make you feel responsible for emotions you never created. Yet this time, you respond differently. You do not rush to explain. You do not search for the perfect words. You do not spend another hour proving that your heart was in the right place. You simply become quiet. And strangely, that silence can reveal more about your emotional growth than 1,000.
And never could.
Because the deepest transformation in a sensitive person is rarely about becoming colder. It is about learning where your emotional responsibility ends and another person's begins. For years, you may have believed that better communication could solve everything. So you explained your feelings. You explained your intentions. You clarified your boundaries. You apologized when someone misunderstood you. You tried to soften every sentence so nobody would feel threatened. You carried the emotional weight of conversations long after they ended. Then something inside you became tired. You started recognizing a pattern that was easy to miss before. Sometimes people are not confused about what you meant. They simply prefer their own interpretation because it protects the story they have already created about you. That realization can be painful because it forces you to confront a difficult truth. Your explanation has power when someone genuinely wants to understand you. It loses power when someone has already chosen their conclusion. In this video, you will discover what happens psychologically when an empath stops explaining. You will learn why the need to constantly clarify yourself can become connected to emotional regulation, external validation, fear of conflict, and the desire to restore emotional harmony. You will also learn the difference between healthy silence and silent treatment, because emotional intelligence is never about manipulating someone through withdrawal. It is about knowing when communication creates understanding and when continued communication simply drains you. We will explore why emotionally mature people can tolerate being misunderstood, immediately define themselves, why boundaries become stronger when they require fewer words, and why caring deeply about another person does not mean becoming responsible for their emotional reactions. There is also a lesser-known side to this transformation. When a deeply sensitive person stops explaining, the biggest change may happen inside their nervous system and emotional habits. The person begins creating a pause between feeling and reacting. That pause creates choice. Instead of automatically rushing toward another person's discomfort, they begin asking a different question. Is this actually mine to fix? That question can change an entire relationship. It can reveal who respects your, who only responds when you overfunctions emotionally, and who was depending on your constant explanations to maintain control of the interaction. And this is where the story becomes even more powerful. The empath who stops explaining does not necessarily lose their compassion. They can become more compassionate because their empathy is no longer mixed with self-abandonment. They can listen without absorbing everything. They can understand without excusing harmful behavior. They can love without constantly proving their love. They can walk away from an argument without feeling defeated. Their silence becomes less about fear and more about discernment. So stay with me until the end, because we are going deeper into the moment when sensitivity becomes strength, when empathy develops boundaries, and when silence becomes a form of emotional intelligence. By the end, you may recognize a change happening within yourself that you once mistook for becoming distant. You may realize that you were never losing your voice. You were simply learning that your worth does not depend on convincing everyone to understand it. Welcome to Conscious Healing Hub. If you value psychology, emotional intelligence, healing, and deeper relationship insights, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because sometimes the most powerful transformation with the words you finally choose to stop repeating. For an empath, explaining can become almost automatic because their attention is often deeply focused on the emotional atmosphere around them. They notice a slight change in someone's tone. They notice when a person becomes quieter, distant, irritated, or uncomfortable. They may sense tension before anyone openly talks about it. This awareness can make them highly responsive to emotional misunderstandings. When someone reacts negatively, the empath may immediately begin searching for an explanation. They want to clarify why they reacted that way, why they needed space, why certain words hurt them, or why their intentions were different from how their behavior was interpreted. At first, this can look like healthy communication, but slowly, explaining can become a way of creating emotional safety. Deep inside, the person may begin believing, if I explain this clearly enough, they will finally understand me and everything will feel safe again. This is where empathy and emotional regulations become closely connected. Research on empathy suggests that the way people regulate their own emotions can influence how effectively they respond to the emotions of others. When emotional awareness becomes intense, the empath may feel pressure to repair every uncomfortable moment. They may keep talking long after their message was already clear, searching for the perfect sentence that will finally remove the tension. But some misunderstandings are created by differences in perception, unresolved emotions, or unwillingness to understand. In these situations, better explanations cannot guarantee better understanding. Every explanation requires emotional energy, and for a deeply sensitive person, that energy can disappear quickly when the conversation becomes a cycle with no real resolution. First, you explain what happened. Then you explain why it hurt. Then you explain why you reacted the way you did. Then you explain that your words were never meant as an attack. Then you explain your intentions again because the other person still seems dissatisfied. Each time you think the conversation is finally becoming clear, another question appears, another accusation emerges, or the standard for being understood moves further away. At that point, you are no longer simply communicating. You are defending your right to have your own feelings and experiences. This can become especially draining for an empath because their attention may shift toward managing or still trying to person's emotional while they actually have their own emotions. Instead of asking, what am I feeling right now? They may become focused on, how can I make this person feel better about what I just said? Over time, that pattern can create emotional fatigue. Research on emotional labor and exhaustion suggests that psychological flexibility and self-compassion can help reduce the harmful effects of emotional dissonance. This means learning to acknowledge difficult emotions
without becoming trapped in the responsibility of fixing every emotional response around you.
The transformation begins with a quiet realization that can completely change the way an empath moves through relationships. Your intentions do not become more valid because someone finally approves of them. For a long time, you may have believed that being understood was proof that you had communicated correctly, loved correctly, or behaved correctly. So when someone questioned your motives, you felt an intense need to defend your heart. But emotional maturity begins when you separate your truth from another person's validation. You can be misunderstood and still know who you are. Someone can dislike your boundary, and that boundary can still be healthy. Someone can disagree with your feelings, and those feelings can still deserve to exist. This creates a deeper form of inner authority. Instead of constantly asking, how can I make this person understand me? The empath begins asking, do I understand myself? That question changes the entire emotional dynamic. You begin examining your intentions without demanding that another person confirm them. You become capable of accepting that someone may tell a completely different story about you while you remain grounded in your own experience. You no longer need every conversation to end with agreement. You need clarity within yourself. And once that clarity becomes stronger than the need for approval, explaining starts to feel very different. Silence is often misunderstood because people tend to associate a quiet response with weakness, fear, or defeat. Yet there is a profound difference between silence to punish someone and silence used to protect emotional stability. Silent treatment can become a form of control when a person deliberately withdraws communication to create anxiety, provoke guilt, or force another person to chase them. Healthy silence carries a completely different intention. It can mean recognizing that a conversation has become unproductive and choosing to pause rather than add more emotional fuel to it. An emotionally intelligent empath learns to notice this difference within themselves. They begin asking, will speaking right now create understanding, or will it simply create another argument? That question can prevent hours of unnecessary emotional conflict. Sometimes continuing to explain gives the other person more material to challenge, reinterpret, or criticize, while a calm pause protects both people from reacting impulsively. Healthy silence does not require manipulation, revenge, or an attempt to make someone suffer. It is simply the ability to regulate your response when emotions become intense. The empath is still present. They are still capable of communicating. They are simply refusing to turn every disagreement into an emotional battle. In this sense, silence becomes less about withholding communication and more about choosing the right moment, the right words, and the right emotional state in which to speak.
For some people, being misunderstood can feel far more painful than the situation itself, because their sense of identity has
Slowly become connected to how other people perceive them. An empath may unconsciously think, if this person sees me as selfish, cruel, difficult, or uncaring, then I must have done something terribly wrong. That belief creates an immediate urge to correct the story, explain every detail, and prove the goodness behind every decision. But emotional maturity begins to break that connection. You start recognizing that another person's interpretation is still their interpretation. It can contain their emotions, expectations, past experiences, and personal assumptions. You can listen to their perspective without automatically turning it into a. You can be criticized without rushing into defense. You can be questioned without feeling that your entire character is on trial. This is the difference between external validation and internal validation. External validation asks, do they understand me? Do they approve of me? Do they agree with me? Internal validation asks something deeper. Do I know why I made this choice? Am I acting according to my values? Can I respect myself even when someone disagrees with me? Once an empath develops that inner foundation, being misunderstood becomes uncomfortable rather than devastating. The need to control another person's perception slowly loses its grip, and the empath becomes freer to communicate from clarity instead of fear.
Emotional intelligence is often mistaken for the ability to talk openly about feelings, but it goes much deeper than finding the right words. It involves recognizing emotions, understanding what they are communicating,
And choosing a response that fits the situation. Sometimes that means speaking clearly and expressing what you need. Sometimes it means asking a thoughtful question before making an assumption.
Sometimes it means pausing because your emotions are too intense for a productive conversation. And sometimes it means setting a boundary when continuing the discussion would only create more tension.
For an empath, this distinction can be especially important because strong emotions can create an urge to respond immediately whenever someone else is upset. Yet immediate communications is not always effective communication.
Research on empathy and interpersonal emotion regulation shows that empathy involves more than recognizing another person's emotional state.
It also involves how people respond to emotions within relationships and how those responses can shape the interaction. This means emotional intelligence is partly about timing. Knowing when your words can create understanding is valuable. Knowing when more words will create confusion is equally valuable. The goal is never to communicate as much as possible. The goal is to communicate with awareness, purpose, and emotional control while recognizing that sometimes a pause can protect the conversation better than another explanation ever could. When someone has become accustomed to your constant explanations, your silence can feel unfamiliar. They may notice that you are no longer rushing to clarify every feeling or defend every decision. They may ask why you are suddenly so quiet, accuse you of changing, or interpret your new boundary as rejection. Sometimes they may even try to pull you back into the old pattern by creating another emotional discussion that requires your attention. This can be difficult for an empath because the instinct to restore harmony may still be strong. You may feel tempted to explain yourself simply because you are uncomfortable with their discomfort. Yet, changing your behavior can reveal something important about the relationship. Perhaps the connection depended heavily on your emotional labor. Perhaps you were always the person who repaired tension, apologized first, clarified misunderstandings, and kept conversations moving. Once you stop automatically performing that role, the relationship can feel different because the old pattern is no longer being maintained in the same way. This does not mean silence should be used to make someone chase you or to create emotional pressure. The deeper shift is about choice. You are allowed to change the way you participate in a relationship. You are allowed to pause before responding. You are allowed to stop repeating yourself, and you do not have to continue a dynamic simply because you once accepted it. Empathy can create a powerful urge to repair every uncomfortable emotion around you. Someone becomes angry, and you immediately start explaining. Someone becomes distant, and you reach out to find out what happened. Someone feels disappointed, and you begin apologizing even when the situation was never entirely yours to carry. Someone misunderstands you, and you search for better words to make your intentions clear. Over time, this pattern can quietly turn into a role where the empath feels responsible for maintaining emotional peace everywhere. You become the person who smooths over tension, absorbs frustration, and tries to make difficult feelings disappear. Yet emotional intelligence teaches a more balanced form of compassion. You can care about someone's emotions without becoming responsible for managing them. Their disappointment belongs to them. Their interpretation belongs to them. Their reaction belongs to them. You can acknowledge those emotions without taking ownership of them. This does not mean becoming indifferent or refusing to take responsibility for your actions. If you have caused harm, accountability still matters. The difference is learning to separate genuine responsibility from emotional over-responsibility. Your responsibility is your behavior, your boundaries, your communication, and your integrity. You can offer an apology when one is sincere, but you do not need to apologize simply because someone feels uncomfortable with your boundary. You can listen without becoming the emotional caretaker of every person you love. Being compassionate does not require you to abandon yourself. An empath can understand another person's pain without accepting responsibility for creating comfort at their own expense. Understanding someone does not mean agreeing with everything they say or do. Forgiving someone does not mean giving them unlimited access to your life. Listening does not mean surrendering your boundaries. Loving someone does not mean constantly proving that your love is real by tolerating behavior that leaves you emotionally depleted. This distinction becomes important because empathy without boundaries can slowly turn into self-abandonment. You begin putting another person's needs ahead of your own emotions, then convince yourself that this is what caring means. Over time, compassion becomes exhausting because there is no space left for your own needs. A healthier form of empathy includes yourself in the equation. You can ask, "What is this person feeling?" while also asking, What am I feeling? You can recognize someone's struggles while still protecting your emotional limits. Research on compassion, self-compassion, and burnout suggests that compassion can support psychological resources, while self-compassion can help people respond to stress and exhaustion with greater emotional flexibility. This creates a more sustainable form of caring. You remain sensitive, but you stop treating your sensitivity as an obligation to rescue everyone. Your empathy becomes a choice rather than a sacrifice, and compassion becomes something that includes your own well-being. The empath's deepest power does not come from making other people understand them. It comes from developing enough internal to trust their own experience without constantly seeking permission from someone else. This changes the way they respond to emotional situations. They become slower to react because they no longer feel compelled to defend themselves immediately. They become more selective with their words because they understand that every emotion does not require an explanation. They become more comfortable with pauses because silence no longer feels like a threat to their identity. Instead of entering another exhausting argument, they can calmly say, I understand your perspective, but I see it differently. They can say, this does not work for me. They can say, I have already explained my position. There is no anger required, no dramatic performance, no attempt to make the other person feel guilty, just clarity. This kind of internal authority is closely connected to emotional regulation.
Research on attachment has found that more secure attachment patterns are generally associated with more adaptive ways of regulating emotions,
while insecure attachment patterns can involve less effective regulation strategies. For an empath, developing this inner stability means learning that another person's emotional reaction does not have to determine their response. They can remain kind without becoming submissive, firm without becoming cruel, and compassionate without surrendering their own judgment. Their power becomes quieter because it no longer depends on being validated. Silence becomes a boundary when it communicates self-respect rather than punishment. For an empath, this can mean recognizing that the conversation has already reached its limit and there is nothing productive left to prove. You can know that you have communicated your position clearly and choose to stop arguing about it. You can decide that you do not need to respond immediately simply because someone expects an instant answer. You can refuse
to defend yourself against every accusation, especially when the conversation has turned into a cycle of blame and justification.
You can even leave on conversation without needing to win it. This is an important shift because emotional maturity does not require victory in every disagreement. Sometimes protecting your peace means accepting that another person may walk away with a different opinion of you. Healthy silence can say, I have heard you, and I am choosing not to continue this conversation in this way. The intention matters deeply. Silence should create peace, not fear. It should give space for emotional regulation rather than create anxiety as a form of control. If silence is being used to punish, manipulate, provoke, or make another person desperate for attention, it has moved away from emotional intelligence. A healthy boundary does not need to make someone suffer. It simply defines what you will participate in and what you will step away from. In that sense, silence becomes a quiet decision rather than a weapon. You can recognize that an empath has outgrown over-explaining by noticing 5 subtle changes in the way they respond to emotional situations. The first is that they respond instead of reacting. They create a pause before defending themselves, giving their emotions time to settle before choosing their words. The second is that they explain once. They communicate their feelings or boundaries clearly, then allow the other person to decide how they want to receive that information. They no longer keep repeating themselves in the hope of finally receiving agreement. The third sign is that they can tolerate being misunderstood. A misunderstanding may still feel uncomfortable, but it no longer feels like an emergency that must be corrected immediately. The fourth sign is that they stop managing everyone's emotions. They still care deeply, but they understand that another person's disappointment, anger, or frustration does not automatically become their responsibility. The fifth sign is that their boundaries become quieter. They no longer need dramatic announcements, long explanations, or emotional speeches to establish what they will accept. Their behavior communicates the boundary. They step back when something feels unhealthy. They reduce their participation when a conversation becomes destructive. They say less because they become clearer about what deserves their energy. These changes may look small from the outside, yet they reveal a significant shift from seeking approval toward trusting their own emotional judgment. This transformation can initially feel lonely because changing your emotional patterns also changes the way certain relationships function. People who became comfortable with your constant availability may notice that you are no longer answering every message immediately, explaining every decision, or rushing to repair every moment of tension. Conversations may become shorter. Some relationships may suddenly feel unfamiliar. And during this stage, you may begin questioning yourself. You may wonder, am I becoming cold? Am I becoming selfish? Should I explain myself one more time? These questions can become especially powerful when you have spent years believing that being caring means always being available. The difficult part is that the old version of you was familiar, even when that version was exhausted. Other people knew how to approach you, what would make you feel guilty, and how quickly you would step forward to restore emotional harmony. Once you begin responding differently, the entire pattern can feel uncertain. Emotional growth can create this discomfort because you are learning an unfamiliar skill. Allowing someone to feel disappointed without immediately abandoning yourself to make that feeling disappear. You begin accepting that someone can be unhappy with your decision while you remain at peace with it. You can care about the relationship without carrying every emotion inside it. The loneliness that appears during this stage does not always mean you are losing the right people. Sometimes it means you are learning how to remain connected without disappearing inside the connection. The empath's new definition of strength begins with a powerful shift in how sensitivity is understood. Strength does not mean becoming less sensitive, emotionally distant, or harder to affect. It means becoming less controlled by everything you sense. You can notice someone's anger without absorbing it into your own emotional state. You can understand someone's pain without immediately stepping into the role of rescuer.
You can recognize manipulation without feeling compelled to expose every hidden motive.
Or prove that you see through it. You can feel deeply without allowing every feeling to dictate your next action. This is where emotional maturity gives sensitivity a new structure. The empath still notices the change in someone's voice. They still sense tension in a room. They still care when someone is hurting. But awareness no longer automatically becomes responsibility. A feeling can be noticed without being carried. A problem can be understood without becoming your mission. A person can be loved without being rescued. This creates a healthier relationship with sensitivity because the empath stops treating emotional awareness as an obligation to act. Their softness remains, but it becomes protected by discernment. Their compassion remains, but it develops limits. Their heart remains open, while their boundaries become stronger. The empath does not lose their softness. They develop structure around it, allowing their sensitivity to become a source of wisdom rather than a constant invitation to emotional exhaustion. The day an empath stops explaining is not the day they stop caring. It is the day they stop abandoning themselves just to be understood. They finally recognize that some people were never truly confused about their intentions. They simply became comfortable with a version of the empath who was always ready to explain, apologize, clarify, and repair. Once that pattern becomes visible, something begins to change. The empath becomes quieter, but also clearer, more deliberate, more grounded. They stop treating every misunderstanding like an emergency. They stop believing that every accusation deserves a defense. Their silence is no longer rooted in fear. It becomes discernment. Their boundaries are no longer apologies. They become decisions. Their empathy is no longer self-sacrifice. It becomes conscious compassion. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of all. You can understand someone without allowing them to define you. You can care about someone without carrying every emotion they experience. You can love deeply without constantly proving that your love is real. You can walk away from an argument without needing to win. You can remain soft without remaining available to every form of emotional chaos. You do not have to explain your heart to everyone who chooses to misunderstand it. Your intentions do not become more valuable because someone approves of them. Your feelings do not become less real because someone disagrees with them. Your boundary does not become wrong because someone dislikes it. Sometimes the most powerful sentence you can speak is the one you no longer need to say. And that is the day an empath discovers the difference between having a voice and needing everyone to hear it. So if this message spoke to something you have been experiencing, take a moment and ask yourself one simple question. Where in my life am I still explaining myself when clarity would be enough? Your answer may reveal more about your emotional growth than you realize. If you have reached that point where you no longer need to explain yourself to everyone, share the words. I no longer need to explain myself in the comments. Your experience may help someone else recognize that they are allowed to choose peace too. And if this video resonated with you, please like the video. Subscribe to Conscious Healing Hub for more insights into emotional intelligence, empathy, boundaries, healing, and the deeper psychology behind human relationships. Remember, your silence does not mean you have lost your voice. Sometimes it means you have finally learned when your voice deserves to be heard.